Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself were in the midst of some great untold struggle. The sky was heavy with dark clouds rolling ominously overhead. The storm had been brewing for hours now, and the thunder that rumbled in the distance grew louder with every passing minute. A torrential downpour began, drenching everything in its path, and the air was thick with the smell of rain and electricity. Inside a small, isolated cabin in the woods, Emma sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket. She had come here for a retreat, hoping to escape the chaos of city life and the demands of her work. She was a freelance writer, but lately her mind had been cluttered with too many distractions, and she hoped that a few days of solitude would help her find some clarity. The cabin had been rented to her by a friend who had promised it would be the perfect place to recharge. But now, as the storm raged outside, she found herself feeling a little unsettled. The cabin was rustic, charming even, but there was something about it that made her skin crawl. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, just an overwhelming sense of unease, as if something was watching her. She glanced at the windows, her eyes narrowing. The rain was coming down so heavily now that it was hard to see anything beyond a few feet, but she could have sworn she saw something move in the distance. A shadow, perhaps, or was it just the wind? Thunder cracked loudly, making the ground shake beneath her feet. Emma jumped, her heart racing. She didn't like thunderstorms, especially when she was alone. The constant flashes of lightning and booming thunder made her feel small and vulnerable, and the isolation of the cabin only amplified that fear. As she sat there, staring into the fire, she heard something. Footsteps. They were soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Her head whipped around toward the door. No one should be here. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and she hadn't seen a soul since she arrived the day before. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath became shallow. Another crack of thunder echoed through the cabin, and the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. They were coming closer, and Emma couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear, her mind racing with possibilities. Could it be an animal? Maybe a deer or a bear wandering too close? But the sound of footsteps was too deliberate, too human. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Of course. The cabin was in a dead zone. She was completely alone. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cracks in the cabin, rattling the windows and making the lights flicker. The fire in the hearth flickered as well, casting strange shadows on the walls. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emma stood, her legs weak beneath her. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but she had to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight from the nearby table, she crept toward the door. Her heart was still pounding, each beat echoing in her ears. The door was locked, but the faint sound of movement outside made her hesitate. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face whatever was out there. With a deep breath, she unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The storm was even worse than before, the rain coming down in sheets, turning the earth outside into a muddy swamp. Emma stepped onto the porch, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The air was thick, cold, and oppressive, like something was pressing down on her chest. Nothing. The porch was empty. The storm roared in her ears, and she scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. She was about to turn back inside when she heard a voice. It was low and guttural, like a whisper, but she could hear it clearly. It came from behind her. "Get out!" Her blood ran cold, and she spun around, flashlight trembling in her hand. There was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the storm raging on in its fury. She slammed the door shut, locking it again, and hurried back to the fireplace. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but something was wrong. Something she couldn't ignore. She sat back down, trying to steady her nerves, but her mind raced with every possible explanation. Was it her imagination? Or was there something truly out there, something that she couldn't see? Thunder crashed again, and she winced at the deafening sound. Her eyes flicked toward the window. This time she definitely saw something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, long and stretched out, moving across the field toward the cabin. Panic seized her chest. She wasn't imagining it. Whatever it was real, and it was coming closer. She bolted up from the chair, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. But the storm was too violent, the roads too treacherous, and there was no phone signal to call for help. The footsteps returned, this time louder and more insistent. They were coming closer, pacing back and forth outside the door, just out of sight. Emma could feel the presence, something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop, and she wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the chill that had settled in her bones. She reached for the flashlight again, shining it toward the door. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a blur. What could she do? She couldn't just sit here forever, waiting for whatever was out there to get her. Then she heard the knock. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. 3 knocks. Each one reverberated through her bones like a warning. She felt her breath catch in her throat, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The knock came again. Louder. Almost frantic. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with terror. No one was supposed to be here. No one could be here. It was impossible. Then the voice returned, this time clearer, more distinct. It was coming from just outside the door, just beyond the threshold. Let me in. Her knees weakened, and she collapsed onto the floor. There was no way she could face whatever was out there. She was trapped, her only escape being the storm that raged outside. The door rattled as if something was trying to force its way inside. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The temperature dropped even further, and Emma's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel something watching her, could sense it even though she couldn't see it. The sound of footsteps returned, but this time they weren't outside the cabin. They were inside, moving slowly, deliberately, as if someone or something was circling her. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and she clutched the flashlight in her trembling hands, trying to steady herself. Her body felt heavy, like the air around her had thickened, and she struggled to breathe. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that weren't human. And then, right beside her ear, she heard it. A soft whisper, like a cold breath against her skin. "Get out!" The voice was harsh, distorted, and full of malice. Emma screamed, bolting upright and scrambling for the door. But before she could make it, a pair of icy hands gripped her shoulders from behind, pulling her back into the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind picked up quickly, howling through the trees and whipping the rain sideways, as if the storm were intent on swallowing the world whole. It was one of those sudden summer thunderstorms, the kind that comes without much warning, when the sky goes from clear to threatening in the span of mere minutes. That evening, Emma had been working in her home office, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She had been living there for just a few months, seeking solace in the quiet isolation of the countryside, away from the noise of the city. The house was old, its creaking floors and drafty windows giving it a charm that was both nostalgic and unnerving. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she welcomed it, especially after the recent loss of her mother. It had been a difficult year, full of grief, and the move to the farmhouse was meant to help her heal, to clear her mind and gain perspective. But as the storm began to rage outside, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was more than just the wild weather. It was a deep, gnawing unease that had settled in her stomach and seemed to be growing with every passing moment. The storm was loud. Too loud. The wind was howling and the rain was pouring so heavily that the windows were nearly fogged up. The light, flickering in the room, made the shadows stretch unnaturally, twisting the furniture and walls into strange, unfamiliar shapes. Emma, feeling an uncomfortable chill crawl down her spine, walked over to the window and peered outside, hoping to see something familiar that would reassure her. But there was nothing. The fields surrounding the farmhouse were dark, the trees swaying violently under the storm's power. The world beyond her home was a blur of rain and wind, and she could barely see the silhouette of the barn at the edge of the property. Everything felt unnervingly still despite the storm's ferocity. There was no sound of wildlife, no rustling of leaves, just the relentless storm. Emma turned back toward the house, rubbing her arms to stave off the chill. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past 9 p.m. She hadn't even realized how late it had gotten, and the sense of unease was only deepening. She tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house, though empty, seemed alive with sounds. Small, subtle things like a faint creaking from the hallway, the soft scratching of something against the walls, or the way the doors seemed to shudder in their frames. She made her way down the creaky hallway to the kitchen to make some tea, hoping that would help settle her nerves. The floorboards groaned under her feet, but it wasn't an unfamiliar sound. The house had always made these noises, and she had grown used to them. But tonight, it felt different. As she reached the kitchen, the power suddenly went out, leaving her in total darkness. The house went deathly silent, save for the deafening sound of the storm outside. For a brief moment, Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding. She wasn't frightened by the darkness. She had lived here long enough to know the quirks of the house. But the silence, it was unsettling. She reached for the matchbox in the drawer, her fingers fumbling as she struck a match to light a candle. The flickering flame cast long, wavering shadows against the walls, but it wasn't enough to calm her growing anxiety. Just as she was about to grab the kettle and heat some water on the stove, she heard it, a faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the hallway. It was so soft that at first she thought she had imagined it, but then she heard it again, a voice, almost too faint to make out, calling her name. Emma. The voice was barely a whisper, like the wind itself was speaking to her, but the tone was clear, urgent, and somehow familiar. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced toward the dark hallway, her heart racing. Emma. The voice called again, this time louder, sharper. It sent a chill down her spine. Without thinking, Emma dropped the match and rushed toward the hallway. Her footsteps were muffled by the storm, but as she moved toward the living room, she noticed the air had become colder. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, and she felt a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. Something was off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew something was wrong. The faint whispering had stopped, but the feeling remained. She stood in the middle of the living room, staring into the darkness, wondering if the storm had simply gotten to her head. Her nerves were shot after all, and the isolation of the farmhouse certainly didn't help. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was watching her. As she moved back toward the kitchen, she glanced at the door to the cellar. It was slightly ajar, the shadows inside dark and impenetrable. Emma had always kept it shut. There was nothing down there, just old, unused furniture and boxes. But for some reason, the cellar door was never fully closed. Every time she'd passed it, it was always a little bit open, though she had no idea why. Tonight, though, it felt different. The door was cracked open just enough for Emma to see something or someone standing in the darkness beyond. Her breath caught in her throat. The feeling of being watched intensified, and she couldn't help but take a step toward the cellar. Her hand hovered over the door handle. Her fingers were icy cold, her entire body trembling as she slowly pushed it open, the old wood creaking in protest. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but what she saw made her blood run cold. There, in the corner of the cellar, was a figure. It was a man, though she could barely make out his features. He was standing completely still, his back facing her, his hands hanging at his sides. His hair was damp, as though he had just come in from the rain. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. It wasn't until the figure slowly turned around that she realized who he was. It was her mother. Her mother, standing there in the dim light of the cellar, staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. Her face was pale, her expression vacant, as if she had been waiting there for years. But her mother had been dead for almost 6 months. Emma had buried her after a long battle with cancer, and the memory of her mother's frail, sickly body was still fresh in Emma's mind. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her heart pounded in her chest to scream, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. Slowly, the figure took a step forward. The air around Emma grew colder, and she could feel her heart hammering in her chest, the chill seeping into her very bones. "Mom?" she whispered, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. The figure tilted its head, and a slow, ghostly smile spread across its lips. But it wasn't her mother's smile. It was something twisted, something wrong. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Emma standing alone in the cellar, her breath ragged, her body frozen in fear. She stumbled back, unable to tear her eyes away from the spot where the figure had been. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a hallucination? The storm, the stress, the isolation, all of it could have contributed to her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, Emma knew that wasn't what had happened. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows, and the house seemed to groan in response. Emma couldn't stay here any longer. She had to leave. With trembling hands, she reached for the door, throwing it open and running into the storm without a second thought. The rain poured down on her, soaking her to the bone, but she didn't care. The cold was nothing compared to the fear gnawing at her insides. She ran out into the field, her feet slipping on the wet ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The storm seemed to follow her, the wind howling in her ears, the thunder cracking above her, and the voice whispering her name again. Emma. The storm raged on, but Emma kept running, her heart pounding, as though she were running from something far worse than the storm itself. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain started just after nightfall, tapping softly against the roof of the small rental cabin. By the time Michael checked the weather report, the storm had grown into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Thick, black clouds rolled over the mountains, swallowing the stars, and the wind picked up, whistling through the trees that surrounded the cabin on all sides. He had come here to get away, to clear his mind after the breakup with Amanda. The remote cabin was cheap, quiet, and isolated, exactly what he had wanted. But now, as the storm raged outside, he wasn't so sure anymore. The power flickered once, twice, then cut out entirely. Michael sighed, setting his phone down. It was at 40% enough to last through the night if he didn't waste the battery. He grabbed the flashlight he had packed, flicked it on, and made his way toward the living room. The fireplace was useless. It hadn't been cleaned in years, according to the listing, but at least he had blankets. Then he heard something. A faint knock. At first he thought it was a branch hitting the cabin, but then it came again. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Someone was knocking at the front door. Michael's stomach tightened. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm? The nearest town was 20 miles away, and the dirt road leading to the cabin was barely drivable even in good weather. Knock. 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 Michael's breath hitched. He hesitated, then moved toward the door. The flashlight beam wobbled in his shaking hand. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. The wind howled, rain pounded against the windows, but beneath it all, a whisper. Let me in. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. The voice was barely audible, blending with the wind, but he had heard it. He swallowed hard and forced his voice to stay steady. Who's there? No answer. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin's small front porch for a split second. Michael's breath caught in his throat. There was someone standing there. Tall, motionless. But he couldn't make out the face. He stepped back, pulse pounding. He didn't know what to do. No car had pulled up, no headlights, no sound of tires crunching on gravel. Knock. Knock. Louder this time. Michael's mind raced. Maybe someone was lost? A hiker? But why wouldn't they say anything? Another flash of lightning. The figure was closer now. Michael's breath hitched. It hadn't moved. He hadn't heard footsteps. And yet, it was standing right in front of the door. He took another step back. His gut screamed at him not to open the door. The voice came again, clearer this time. Let me in. Michael's blood ran cold. It was wrong. Something about the way the words were stretched, distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Then, the doorknob rattled. Michael's body locked up. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knob turned again. Slowly, deliberately. Michael forced himself to move, stumbling backward. His hand fumbled for something, anything to defend himself. His fingers closed around the iron fireplace poker. Silence. For a moment, all he could hear was his own ragged breathing. Then, bang! The door shook violently. Michael jolted, gripping the poker tighter. Another bang. The wood splintered slightly near the lock. Michael's brain screamed for him to run, but where? Outside into the storm? No way. Lightning flashed again, and through the small window at the top of the door, Michael saw the face. His own. staring back at him, his breath caught in his throat. The thing outside wasn't just knocking anymore. It was mimicking him, copying him. The mouth moved. "Let me in." Michael's legs finally obeyed. He turned and ran, nearly tripping over the coffee table in his scramble to get away. He sprinted down the hallway into the bedroom and slammed the door shut. He locked it. His mind was spinning. His own face, his own voice. "It's not real. It's not real." The knocking started again. Not at the front door, at the bedroom window. Michael turned slowly, dread curling in his stomach. The window was just a few feet from his bed. His flashlight flickered as he lifted it, shining it toward the glass. The face was there, pressed against the window pane, grinning. Michael stumbled back, nearly falling over the bed. The thing outside didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. A whisper seeped through the glass. "Let me in." Michael squeezed his eyes shut. He clutched the poker so tightly his knuckles ached. The whispers continued, slithering through the cracks in the window frame. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." Then, a creak. The bedroom door. Michael's stomach dropped. He turned. The door was open, wide open, but he had locked it. His breath hitched. A single wet footprint was on the wooden floor just inside the doorway. His ears rang with silence. The air felt thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him. Then the lights flickered. For the briefest second, just as the bulb flared to life, a figure stood in the doorway. Michael didn't see its face, didn't want to. He grabbed his phone, bolted through the bathroom door, and locked himself inside. His hands shook as he dialed 911. Static, no signal, no service. The wind howled outside, but the knocking had stopped. Silence. Michael pressed himself against the cold tile, his heart hammering in his chest. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper, right against the wood. "I'm already inside." Michael's body went rigid. He barely had time to process the words before the lights went out, and something breathed against his neck. The next morning, the storm had passed. When the rental owner arrived to check on the cabin, he found the front door wide open. Inside, the furniture was undisturbed. The power was back on. Everything was as it should be. Except for one thing. Michael was gone. His phone lay on the bathroom floor, screen cracked. His car was still parked outside, untouched. His bag, his clothes, his wallet, everything remained. But Michael was never seen again. Some say he ran. Some say he got lost in the storm. But the owner of the cabin swore something else. Sometimes on stormy nights when the wind howls through the trees and the rain pounds against the roof, if you stand outside the cabin and listen closely, you can still hear it. A soft, rhythmic knocking coming from inside. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the trees, shaking the old wooden house as if it were made of paper. The storm had been building all evening, a slow and deliberate gathering of dark clouds that swallowed the sky. The air had grown thick and heavy, pressing down on the landscape like an omen. By the time the first crack of thunder split the night, the entire house trembled as though something ancient and unseen had awakened. David sat on the couch, staring at the darkened window. The power had gone out 20 minutes ago, plunging the house into a suffocating stillness, interrupted only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. He had been staying in his grandparents' farmhouse for a few weeks, helping to clean out the place after his grandfather's passing. The house had been in their family for generations, a relic of a past that seemed to cling to every creaking floorboard and peeling wallpaper. He had never liked the place, even as a child. It always felt off. It wasn't just the age of the house or the way it stood alone on the edge of the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was something deeper, something he had never been able to explain. His grandmother used to say that storms carried voices, that when the wind howled through the trees, it was whispering secrets from the dead. As another flash of lightning illuminated the room, David saw something move outside the window. A shadow, barely visible against the rain-soaked glass. His breath caught in his throat. It was probably a tree branch swaying in the wind. Probably. The thunder rolled again, long and deep, rattling the walls. And then, over the sound of the storm, he heard something else. A knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was unsure whether to announce their presence. Knock. David sat frozen, his fingers gripping the armrest of the couch. The front door was locked. He was sure of it. The storm had driven away any logical reason for someone to be outside. No one should be there. Knock, knock. Louder this time. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand. He moved toward the door, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The house groaned as another gust of wind slammed against it, but his attention was fixed on the door. "Who's there?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the window beside the door, and in that brief moment, he saw it. A figure. Standing in the rain, just beyond the porch. David's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He backed away from the door, his mind racing for an explanation. The figure hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. The storm was too violent for someone to just be standing there, waiting. Knock, knock, knock. Harder this time. David's fingers hovered over the lock. He knew he shouldn't open it. Every instinct in his body screamed against it. But there was a part of him, a small, foolish part that needed to see, to know. He took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The wind and rain rushed in immediately, slapping him with cold air. He squinted through the downpour, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there. But the porch was empty. His stomach twisted. He stepped forward, his bare feet touching the damp wood. The storm raged around him, but he felt something else, something beneath the wind, a presence. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, he saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the property just beyond the tree line, watching. His breath came in ragged gasps. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Storms carry voices. The wind whispers for the dead. A sudden, deafening crack of thunder sent him stumbling back inside. He slammed the door shut and turned the lock. His hands were shaking. The rain pounded against the house, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. He backed away from the door, his mind spinning. The figures, had he really seen them? Or was it a trick of the storm? Then he heard it again. Not from the front door, not from the window, from inside the house, a creaking floorboard. David's body went rigid. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, his pulse roaring in his ears. The darkness inside the house felt heavier, more suffocating. His phone was on the table, but he didn't dare move toward it. Another creak, then another. Footsteps. Coming down the hallway. David's breath hitched. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear it. Slow, deliberate steps moving toward him. Then, the whisper. David. His blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar, but impossible. His grandfather. He turned, heart-pounding, searching the darkness for a shape, a shadow, anything. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the hallway for just a moment. And that's when he saw him. His grandfather. Or something that looked like him. But the figure was wrong. The face was pale, the eyes sunken and hollow, the mouth hung open in a silent scream. His grandfather had been buried weeks ago, and yet here he was. The storm raged outside, but the house had fallen deathly silent. The figure stood there, unmoving, watching him. David couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure raised one hand and pointed. David felt something shift in the air around him, a sudden and crushing weight pressing against his chest. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many. A chorus of whispers, rising and falling like the wind. Leave. David didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, crashing through the living room, throwing open the door and sprinting into the storm. The rain blinded him, the wind clawing at his skin, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could still hear them, the whispers. The storm carried them away, but they followed him, haunting the wind, promising they would return. David never set foot in that house again. And on stormy nights, even miles away, he could still hear the voices, still whispering his name. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The storm came on fast. A heavy, oppressive blanket of dark clouds rolled across the sky, swallowing the light, turning day into an eerie twilight. The first crack of thunder rattled the windows, and Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She had always been sensitive to storms, but this one felt different, darker, heavier, as though the storm was trying to tell her something. Her husband, Mark, was downstairs, fiddling with the old radio in the living room, trying to get a signal. The radio had been acting up for weeks, ever since they had moved into this old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for nearly a decade, and no one seemed to know much about its past. Mark had always been drawn to old homes, and when they found this place for sale at a bargain price, he jumped on it without hesitation. At first, Emma had been thrilled by the idea of living in the countryside, away from the noise and the bustle of the city. The house, though old and worn, had a certain charm. There were creaky floorboards and drafty windows, but it felt like a home. Until the storm came. Emma had noticed strange things since they moved in. Objects out of place, a faint whisper in the air when no one was around, shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of her vision. But every time she tried to tell Mark, he brushed it off. "It's just the house settling," he'd say. "Old places are always like this." Still, the feeling gnawed at her. The storm outside intensified. Emma could hear the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows. The power flickered and the lights dimmed before going out entirely, plunging the house into complete darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, followed by the earth-shaking rumble of thunder. She called out to Mark. "Mark, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he shouted back, his voice muffled by the distance. "Just the power going out. I think I can get the backup generator going." Emma sighed and sat down at the kitchen table, trying to calm her racing heart. The storm was so loud now that it felt as though the house was shaking with every flash of lightning. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling very small in the vast, empty house. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, a gentle tapping sound, almost like a finger against the wood. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked toward the door, but the sound didn't come from there. It came from upstairs, from the hallway above her. It sounded like it was right outside the bedroom door. Her heart began to race. She was alone in the house, or at least she thought she was. She hadn't seen Mark come upstairs. Another knock echoed through the silence, this time louder. "Mark?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The house was still. Not a sound except for the storm outside and her own breathing. But the knocking came again, this time more insistent, a rhythmic pounding. Emma stood up slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. She moved cautiously toward the staircase, feeling her way along the dark walls, her pulse quickening with every step. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The knocking had stopped too, but there was something else now, something darker. A cold draft swept through the hallway, and Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She stared into the darkness at the top of the stairs, unable to move, the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. "Mark?" she called again, but her voice sounded distant, swallowed by the storm and the silence of the house. She had to check. She had to know if someone was upstairs. Emma took a deep breath and started up the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. As she neared the top, a flash of lightning lit up the hallway, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. For a split second, she thought she saw something move, a dark figure standing in the corner of the hallway. She blinked, but it was gone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light leaked from within, though the power was out. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. She pushed the door open slowly and froze. The room was empty. The bed was made, the furniture in place, but there was something wrong. On the floor near the foot of the bed was a small pile of dust, as though something had been dragged across the carpet. But it was the center of the room that caught her eye. There, in the dim light, was a chair. The chair was facing the corner of the room, its back to her. The odd thing was that the chair was moving. It wasn't turning on its own, but it was rocking back and forth, slowly, as if someone were sitting in it and gently swaying. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She backed away, her feet stumbling over the old floorboards. She had to get out of that room. But before she could turn, she heard a soft, guttural whisper. "Leave." The voice was barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. Emma spun around, her heart racing in her chest. The rocking chair had stopped, and in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was a woman, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair. She was wearing an old-fashioned white dress, the fabric tattered and stained with what looked like dirt or blood. Emma's blood ran cold as she stared at the figure, her mind screaming to run, to get out of the house. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her with empty, hollow eyes. "Leave," the voice whispered again, only this time it sounded closer, as though it was right behind her. Without thinking, Emma turned and bolted from the room, down the stairs and out the front door, ignoring the pounding rain and the wind that whipped against her skin. She ran across the yard, her feet slipping in the mud, until she reached the road. Her car was parked down the street, and she didn't hesitate. She fumbled with the keys, unlocked the door, and threw herself inside. The engine roared to life, and Emma slammed the car into gear. She didn't look back as she sped down the road, the storm blurring everything outside her window. But as she drove away, she could have sworn she saw something in the rearview mirror. A flash of white standing in the middle of the road, watching her leave. She didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town, where she found a small hotel and checked in. It wasn't until she was sitting in the room, wrapped in blankets, that she let herself think about what had happened. But even then, her mind couldn't quite make sense of it. The knocking, the figure in the room, the voice that had whispered to her. She had to be imagining things, right? She had to be. The house was old, and the storm had been so violent. It was easy to see how the mind could play tricks in such conditions. And yet a part of her knew. Deep down, she knew she had seen something. Something that wasn't a trick of the storm or her mind. Something that had been waiting in that house for a very long time. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The thunderstorm started slowly, almost like it was testing the air. The first few raindrops splashed against the windows of the old farmhouse, lightly at first, as if the sky was unsure. It wasn't until the wind picked up that Emma began to feel uneasy. She had never liked storms, never gotten used to the way the air thickened and pressed against your skin like a warning, as though something unseen was lurking just beyond the veil. But today, as the storm began to build, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The farmhouse had been standing empty for years before Emma and her husband Sean bought it. It was an old, weather-worn structure nestled on the edge of a small town in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find a young couple looking for a home, but they had both fallen in love with it from the moment they stepped through the door. It had an air of history, of stories untold. The kind of house that whispered secrets to you when you least expected it. At first, everything had been perfect. The house was large enough for them to build a life in, with a sprawling kitchen that Emma loved, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and an expansive backyard that was perfect for their 2 young children. It was isolated enough that they could escape the noise of the world, but close enough to town to make it convenient for grocery runs. And for a while, it seemed like the perfect place to start over. But lately, Emma had begun to notice things. Little things, almost imperceptible at first. A light flickering in the corner of her eye, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when she was sure she was alone, the strange chill that would wash over her in the middle of the night. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling, the wind creaking through the wooden floors. But as time went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. The storm outside intensified, and Emma couldn't help but feel trapped in the house, as if the wind and rain had somehow locked her in. She stood by the window, watching the trees bend and sway under the weight of the gusts. The sky flashed with the white-blue brilliance of lightning, illuminating the darkening landscape for a split second before everything was swallowed by shadow again. The storm had come quickly, and now it seemed to have a life of its own, relentless and furious. Sean was downstairs, tinkering with the old radio they had inherited with the house. He had been obsessed with it for days, trying to get a decent signal, but no matter how many times he adjusted the dial, the radio only hissed and crackled. Emma sighed and turned away from the window, her thoughts returning to the strange sensations she had been experiencing lately. As she made her way toward the staircase, a sudden gust of wind slammed into the side of the house, rattling the windows. The force of it made the house groan and creak, a deep, eerie sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the storm, not this time. This was something else. The feeling was sudden, like an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest, and she felt the unmistakable pull of dread creeping up her throat. "Sean?" she called down the stairs, her voice trembling despite herself. He didn't answer right away, but Emma could hear him muttering under his breath. She took a deep breath and descended the stairs slowly, her feet echoing in the silence of the house. "Sean?" she called again, her voice more insistent this time. The old radio continued its hissing, but now she could hear Sean moving around in the living room. She rounded the corner, expecting to find him sitting in his usual spot on the couch, absorbed in his work with the radio, but he wasn't there. She frowned, stepping further into the living room. The space was empty, save for the furniture and the occasional dust mote floating lazily in the dim light from the storm outside. "Sean?" Her voice was shaky now, laced with concern. And then she heard it. A faint creak, the soft sound of floorboards shifting, coming from upstairs. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. The feeling of dread returned, stronger this time. She wasn't alone. Panic gripped her chest as she hurried up the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and the sound of thunder reverberated through the walls, making the house feel like it was alive, breathing and groaning in response. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and silent except for the low hum of the storm outside. Emma took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow, every muscle in her body tense. She reached out for the light switch, but as her fingers brushed the cold metal, the lights flickered and went out entirely. The house was now plunged into complete darkness. "Sean?" she whispered into the void. No response. She stepped forward again, this time feeling her way along the wall, her fingers brushing the wallpaper, searching for the familiar texture of the switch. Her heart was racing now, and every creak of the house seemed like it was right behind her, breathing down her neck. She rounded the corner into the bedroom, and the air felt colder here, like a deep chill had settled into the room. The window was open, rain pouring in, and Emma immediately closed it, not caring about the wetness splashing against her legs. As soon as she did, she heard a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Leave." Emma froze. It wasn't her imagination. She had heard something, a voice, barely above a whisper. She turned around slowly, her eyes straining in the dark. Her pulse thudded in her throat as she scanned the room, but it was empty. The bed was undisturbed, the furniture exactly as it should be. Another whisper. Louder this time. "Leave." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to get out of the room, get out of the house, but her legs felt like lead, like the air had thickened around her, holding her in place. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and the sound seemed to echo inside the house as well. The storm was a violent, living thing now, shaking the walls of the house, and then above the roar of the wind, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the attic. Emma's heart stopped. The attic. They hadn't been up there since they moved in. The stairs leading to the attic were old, creaky, and covered in dust. No one went up there. But someone had. And now they were walking toward her. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was coming down the stairs, slow and heavy, like they had all the time in the world. Emma's legs finally gave way, and she stumbled back toward the door, but it was too late. The footsteps had stopped. The door to the attic was already opening. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the lightning outside. It was a woman, dressed in a faded white gown, her hair matted and unkempt, hanging in front of her face. Emma couldn't see her eyes, but she felt their gaze, cold and unblinking. The woman spoke, her voice rasping as if it hadn't been used in years. "Leave," she whispered again, her voice like the crackling of dry leaves. Emma could only stare, paralyzed by fear. The woman stepped forward, her feet not touching the ground. Each movement was unnatural, like she was gliding. The air grew colder, and Emma's breath turned to mist in front of her face. Then, without warning, the woman reached out. Her fingers were skeletal, impossibly thin, and they closed around Emma's wrist with a grip that felt like ice. The storm outside raged even louder, as if answering the woman's silent command. Thunder cracked so loudly that it shook the walls, and Emma felt herself being pulled toward the figure, dragged by the icy grip. Suddenly, a voice broke through the chaos. Sean's voice. "Emma, get away from her!" In the split second before the figure could pull her into the shadows, Emma snapped back to reality. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she broke free from the woman's grip and stumbled backward. The figure didn't move, but the air felt as if it had released a breath it had been holding for decades. Sean was at the top of the stairs now, his face pale and wide-eyed. He reached out a hand, and Emma didn't hesitate. She ran toward him, and together they fled from the house. They never went back. The storm continued to rage that night, but Emma and Sean drove far away from the farmhouse, never looking back. And in the days that followed, they did some digging. The house had a history, one filled with strange disappearances, rumors of madness, and a woman who had died alone, lost to time. They never spoke of it again, but every thunderstorm that rolled in would remind them of that night, the figure in the doorway, and the voice that still whispered in the wind. Leave. Story the end.